Okay, 3 minutes past 2. Let's start this second day. I'd like to welcome everybody very warmly to the second day of our workshop. My name is Leonhard Lades, and I'm a member of the UCD Behavior Science and Policy Research Group. And together with researchers from the London School of Economics, Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science, we have organized this workshop. And we're really glad. This is now kind of the halftime of the workshop. We start the second half, and the first day was brilliant. Yesterday, so many interesting patterns. It was really great. So we're extremely grateful to the funding from the National University of Ireland, who has made this possible. And only yesterday was great, and maybe today will be even better. We see whether it will be better. But everything that we're doing here is under the umbrella of these three themes that you see in the title: behavior, well-being, and the environment. And the idea why we did this was, well, for one, we realized that the research that we are doing at the LSE and UCD is very much captured by these three words. But the other one that is maybe more important is that we realized that most of the time, people only look at two of them. So yesterday we heard a lot about how the environment affects well-being, or how maybe well-being can affect the environment from here and there. And today we focus more about, in the presentations at least, how maybe there are behavioral change interventions that can lead to more pro-environmental behavior. So, and what we really thought is that maybe there is more to be said by combining all three elements of them. Just as an example, could we use well-being research to evaluate the welfare effects of behavioral interventions in the environmental sector? Or could we think of well-being interventions to change environmental behavior? We think there's really on this triangle of three different topics, there's really a lot to be done. And that's what we wanted to do the workshop here, work on these three areas. So while we talked about well-being and environment yesterday a lot, today we talk a little bit more about behavior and the environment. But I would like to encourage everybody to think a little bit how we can integrate the well-being elements to this as well. And I think that's what the panel discussion will do a lot as well. So it's really interesting in this area. I don't think there's too much research on this triangle of these three topics. So would be really interested in hearing everybody's thoughts on these, starting with the panel and then later on the presentations. So I think now a little bit of housekeeping. So in terms of the schedule, what will happen today is I will hand over to Professor Liam Delaney in a bit, and he will then moderate the panel. After Liam's panel discussion moderation, we're so grateful to have these panelists here. It's really, really stellar lineup. We're super happy to have the lineup and the workshop. Afterwards, Dr. Ganga Shrida will take over. She will moderate the presentations today. She might even ask you to put your videos on for a little picture. We see. It's up to Ganga. Then we will have a little bit here and there as a break, of course, but then there will be also some networking session, just a short session where we put ourselves in breakout rooms, and we'll end up with some final remarks then at the end. The workshop is being recorded, so if you don't want to appear on the recording, please keep your video off. If you have your video on, that's great, and we'd like to see some faces, and it's brilliant to know who we're talking to. If you don't want to have the video on, that's totally fine. If you're not speaking, please be on mute. If you're speaking, obviously unmute yourself, please. We have the schedule in the chat. I think Daniele, who helped us a lot in organizing this, put the schedule in the chat. So it's a PDF, but it's also available online wherever you saw this. And that's, I think, the housekeeping. So the next point is moving over to Professor Liam Delaney. Just 3 words about Liam. Because Liam is the perfect person to moderate a workshop that is co-organized by the LSE and the UCD Department of Behavioral Science groups, because he kind of founded the UCD one and is heading now the LSE one. So it's really brilliant. Liam is right now the head of the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science at the LSE. We're super grateful and glad that Liam can be here to moderate the panel. And that's what we will do now. Liam, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Leo, and congratulations to everyone on organising such a fantastic workshop. We've a stellar panel at the moment. I was reading the panel's bios, and I can assure you that if I attempted to do it full justice, we wouldn't get through the hour. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to each of the panelists and ask them just an introductory question. So I hope we have a really interesting panel discussion, and then I will move it open to Q&As. Once we've got through some preliminary questions. So our panelists today are Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, who is an environmental psychologist and director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations We've got Professor Sander van der Linden, who's Professor of Social Psychology in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge and Director of the Cambridge Social Decision Making Lab. Dr. George McCarran, who's a Senior Lecturer in Economics at the University of Sussex and has well known for research on well-being and the environment across many applications over the last number of years. Professor Susana Ferreira, who's Professor in Agriculture and Applied Economics at the University of Georgia, and whose research and teaching focuses on the applications of principles of economics to understanding and optimizing how environmental and natural resources are designed and managed. And then Professor Andrew Oswald, who's Professor of Economics and Behavioral Science at the University of Warwick. So
just a flag, Leo, just that Andrew was yesterday. Sorry about that.
I beg your pardon. I was wondering. I thought he'd be on the panel.
You had me worried there. I thought
Andrew, sorry, Andrew, if I've dropped you in it. Today. So, Andrew, you're off the hook. Apologies for that. So, thank you very much, everyone. So, I'd just like to begin with the panelists. So, maybe moving from in the order. So, with Professor Whitmarsh and then Professor Linden, Dr. McCarran, and Dr. Ferreira. Could you just, maybe just to try to animate this for the audience, could you give us an example, either from your own research or more generally an area that you think is particularly important, connecting environment and well-being? So maybe just an example that really illustrates why you think this is an important area of research, or an example of an area that you really think will grow in importance over the next few years. So starting with Professor Whitmarsh.
Yeah, thanks very much, Liam. Thanks for the invitation to join you today. Actually, it's funny that the introduction that Leonard gave actually did point out that a lot of the work tends to be looking at just two of these three things. And actually, I'd say the majority of our work is probably looking more at behaviour and the environment. So how can we change our behaviour to protect the environment or reduce the impact on the environment? So that is where most of our work's doing focus, but actually increasingly we are seeing links between those two things and well-being. And to give maybe one concrete example, a lot of our work has started to highlight the co-benefits of climate action for health and well-being. And so well-being in its broadest sense, physical and mental well-being. And so, yeah, for example, low carbon diets and low carbon travel very often are good for physical health, but they're also good for mental health to some extent. So we know that physical activity can improve mental well-being. And in some other work that we've done, we've found that low consumption lifestyles is also linked to well-being. So people that generally adopt a range of green behaviours, so they consume less, fewer goods, they travel more sustainably, they maybe join a community group that's focused on the environment. So a whole range of different green things. On average, those people have higher subjective well-being than people that don't do so many green things. And there's a huge implication there, is that we can tell people you could be happier if you looked after the environment, actually, contrary to what our leaders in the UK, at least, have suggested in their net zero strategy, which is that the implication there is if we're asking you to change your behaviour, it's about sacrifice, and we don't want to do that. Actually, what we found is that the opposite is the case. If you take action on climate change, chances are there's a good chance it will make you happier, actually.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point to jump off, and thank you very much. And we'll come back to that point, because I think it's really fascinating. So it's Professor van der Linden next, please.
Thank you, Liam. Yeah, so it's interesting. I guess I don't always conceptualize it as a traditional well-being measure, but I'm very interested in the idea that people seem to derive I guess there's a lot of economists in the room, so in the words of James Andreoni, a lot of warm glow from helping the environment. And interestingly, when people are made aware that they've not done so well, they could experience what he called a cold prickle. And so the mechanisms of cold prickle and warm glow to regulate how people feel mentally about their contribution to the environment, I've been very fascinated by. And in some of our research, what we found is that people actually do seem to derive a sense of warm glow uniquely to helping the environment. And so I've done some work trying to differentiate the sort of feel-good affect. So I would conceptualize it not necessarily as happiness, but more as a transient sort of affective state, an anticipatory affective state that people experience that's different from our warm glow from helping other people. And I think there was some interesting discussion there, whether or not the types of positive feelings that we receive from helping other people is different maybe from the types of emotional benefits that we get from contributing to the environment. And what's interesting to me about this mechanism is not so much that people feel good when they help the environment, but that I could actually think of it as a virtuous feedback cycle. And so the idea here is that when people anticipate that doing something will make them feel good, so it will improve their well-being, then when they actually experience a positive emotion, that should then increase the level of anticipation that people have, which would then feed back into the experience. But there's a real lack of modeling of these sort of dynamic positive feedback systems, a lack of bidirectional causality sort of experiments to try to tease that out. So I've been particularly interested in that. And then completely unrelated, something I stumbled into by accident that I think is very interesting. I did some evaluations of trials in prison populations to assess the effect of exposure to nature on well-being. And it just reminded me that there's not a lot of research that looks on the effects of nature on special underrepresented populations. And so often when we talk about population effects in public health, we talk about the average, but not so much how policies affect different subgroups of people. And I think that's an interesting question too.
Fantastic. And I see people are putting papers in the chat, and that's great. If anyone has suggestions for readings or any points they want to raise in the chat, please go for it. So it's Dr. McCarran next.
Thanks, Liam, and thanks, everyone. It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I have a brilliant answer. It kind of makes me think that back when I was applying for my PhD, I was sort of agnostic about whether I was going to address environmental behaviour and well-being or environmental quality and well-being. It was a little while ago now. And I chose environmental quality and well-being because it seemed easier. And I kind of feel like I need to catch up a little bit. And I mean, I think it is difficult to sort of try and relate all these three things together at once. So I guess just some slightly random thoughts. I mean, I think, in relation to sort of the core of my existing research, I think there's still a lot more work to be done on quantifying and valuing the contribution of natural environments to well-being in a way that's sort of sufficiently convincing and causal to interest HM Treasury and people similarly around the world. I think it's obvious that natural environments make us all feel better. I think everyone knows that it's obvious, but until you have a money value on it, it's quite difficult, I think, to get in the room when the biggest decisions are being made. And I sometimes feel a bit conflicted about that because, environmental valuation, perhaps we know the price of everything and the value of nothing, but then as other economists have pointed out, if you don't try and value something, then it will get assigned zero value, and that's not a good situation to be in. I think one other point that would be quite interesting would be to look at different kinds of well-being accounts. So I sometimes feel there's a sort of slightly kind of a gentle conspiracy in economics just to talk about life satisfaction, because then it looks like utility and you don't have to deal with the kind of complications of there being 3 or 4 different things we might mean by well-being and confusing policymakers. But I imagine that, the impact of pro-environmental behaviour on well-being may well be quite different depending on what account you're considering. So, if you're looking at meaning and purpose, eudaimonia, and so on, it's easy to see how those things might be positively influenced by taking actions that are going to save the world. I also imagine that, our hedonic moment-to-moment happiness and potentially also our evaluative happiness is less obvious how we draw those immediate positive links, although, the previous speakers on the panel have been very optimistic on that, which is good to hear. So I suspect either there's research to be done there or I've got some reading to do. I also would be potentially a little bit interested in, the idea of utility misprediction in this area. How much fun do people really have doing things that destroy the environment? And, this is based mainly on personal prejudices, such as I find it really hard to imagine that flying to New York for a weekend to shop could possibly be fun for anyone, although I'm informed that that does happen. And that's partly because I hate flying. And maybe one thing we need to do is publicize air disasters much more widely so that everyone will hate flying as much as I do. But I think it would be interesting to find out what some of these changes really do. For example, is it really less fun to take 1 3-week holiday that involves a long haul flight in a year than 3 1-week holidays that involve a long haul flight in a year? And if it's not less fun to do fewer longer holidays, then can we try and sort of reduce systemic barriers that prevent people from doing that? And actually, all kinds of other systemic barriers that people might well enjoy working a 4-day week more than they enjoy working a 5-day week. Particularly people, I'm thinking of sort of commercial lawyers on huge salaries who have no time to enjoy the huge salaries that they earn, and also don't have the option to do 4 days a week because working anything less than 80 hours in a week is sort of defined as a sign of a lack of commitment and so on. So I do think there are kind of structural things that can be done. And finally, I guess there's kind of quite a lot of interesting work probably around cultural meanings. When we're talking about, we can tell people that they can behave more environmentally and have fun doing it. It feels a little bit like we're telling everyone they've got to be hippies, and that's fine. It's fine for me, but I don't know if everyone's going to like that. And it's complex. It's way out of my comfort zone. It's probably not a thing that I'm capable of researching. But I think figuring out what the cultural meaning of some of this activity is absolutely critical when we're interested in advertising and sort of behavior change messaging. Advertising, I think, it gives you tools to communicate to other people about yourself. The point of advertising, people spend millions of pounds so that when I take this brand of beer to a party, I know that everyone knows that says something particular about me. And I think, figuring out what those meanings are environmentally and how we kind of get people to want those environmental meanings in the products that they buy and get advertisers to advertise those is probably another big and important area. And I'll stop there.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And Professor Ferreira, you're last in the queue.
All right. Thank you so much for the invitation. I was trained as an economist, as an environmental economist. So I put a lot of weight on trying to address the market failures and on trying to use the price signals to do that. So I think that we cannot forget about the power of prices to change behavior, but we need to convince policymakers that they need to adopt the policies to price things properly. So for example, research on the public acceptability of a carbon tax, I think is very important. I think that environmental behavior is very, can make a difference, but you need to add a lot of environmental behaviors to make a big change. So prices can help us do that. We need to make carbon taxes and environmental taxes acceptable and learn how to do that. We also need to change the culture. So I will go back to Andrew's presentation yesterday, very effective public campaigns on stopping smoking. So why not the same for carbon and our dependency on fossil fuels? And then going into the evaluation, actually, most of what I do is, well, I should say that many of these problems are, well, as we know, very interdisciplinary, and we work with people not just in psychology, maybe an economist, or even in sociology when you want to make these big societal changes, but also with natural scientists, with engineers. One of the initiatives I'm involved with is an initiative to mainstream the implementation of nature-based solutions. So we are asked as economists to make the value case, to put a monetary value on those, unquantifiable nature experiences. And in some cases it's easy, right? I mean, you look at flood control of some of those, of a wetland, you look at carbon sequestration. In some other cases is much more difficult. And so I think that the life satisfaction approach has, and using subjective well-being data is very important, but there are still many open questions. Mirko reminded us of some of them yesterday. And one of them is to calculate the marginal utility of income. I believe that we are living in a time in which there are great natural experiments that can help us do that. COVID has been a massive natural experiment, and unconditional transfers. Unconditional transfers that were also happening before COVID. So I think we should start looking into those. You know, in Finland, in some regions in Spain, in Kenya. Anyways, so I'll stop there. I think we can start, you know, doing more valuable valuation, and maybe, and I think we will find that that actually the marginal utility of income is pretty low. I am convinced that, you know, when we were finding those huge values of amenities in our papers, is because they are massively valuable.
That was a really stimulating round of comments, and I have many questions that I've been asked to ask by different members of the organising committee, but I think I'm going to pick a subset so that we have a chance to really tease through them in depth. So the second question, and it's come out, I think, in a lot of the talks and in a lot of the comments, and I would say also in many of the sessions we ran in LSE, we've had people like George Lowenstein speak, and we've got many good scholars, and they've sort of all converged, I think, onto a view that there isn't really a trade-off between short-run well-being and long-run environmental sustainability. And I've heard that point reinforced so many times that I've worryingly come to nearly believe it. So my brain starts telling me there must be a catch. But I just wonder, when we think about the messaging of short-term sacrifice for longer-term or even intergenerational fairness, do you think, let me put the point to you, do you think that actually what the literature is saying is that there's not necessarily that tension at all, and that many of the behaviors that you're actually trying to change environmentally, or the structures you're trying to create environmentally, are almost all working in the direction of improved well-being? Or is that a ridiculous simplification and missing a lot? So I hope that question is clear enough, but do you think that trade-off exists, or do you think it's more reinforcing, or even can you think of counterexamples? So I might switch to first names now, if that's okay, having introduced us all by our formal titles. So Lorraine first.
Yeah, thanks. I think actually, I mean, I was just skimming through Kate Laffen's article that she just posted, and where she's distinguished between eudaimonic and hedonic well-being, and George mentioned this also just now. So I think that's important to sort of maybe say it's difficult to generalize about well-being, and that all green behaviors equate to all types of well-being, because clearly some behaviors are deeply inconvenient, costly, stressful, etc., even though they're good for the environment. Whereas others maybe are actually enjoyable. Engaging in green, community activities, for example, you get that kind of sort of maybe warm glow of being with like-minded people, etc. That sense of social support, and some other behaviours like active travel, etc. Too. And overall, we see this sense that it is contributing to people's sense that they have a meaningful life, that they have a satisfying life and a sense of purpose. And so I think sort of on average, probably there is a positive, like, short-term wellbeing benefit, and this long-term kind of pro-environment, the benefit to the planet and future generations. But obviously the nuances are that the way in which society is currently structured is not necessarily to make it easy and convenient and cheap and whatever to do green things. So there are sometimes well-being costs to certain behaviours. So I think it's a bit nuanced, but mostly I talk about the fact that they are compatible. Let's put it that way.
Great. Nuance is a great thing to have in a session like this. Thank you for that. And
sorry, Liam, if I may elaborate on that, I will say that it is not only certain behaviors, that is also maybe the same behavior on different groups of people. And, like looking at, Sander was saying, looking at underrepresented populations. So maybe, if you are poor, you really don't derive any warm glow from doing an environmental behavior that is going to be costly and is going to deprive you from doing other things with your money or your time.
No, not at all. Great.
No,
George.
Yeah, sorry.
George, did you want to come in next?
Sure. I mean, again, I feel like I don't have a big body of literature to draw on here, so I'm kind of, just speculating essentially. And I said some of what I wanted to say, I think, in the first section, which, I think different accounts of well-being are interesting. I think looking at utility misprediction in this context is interesting. I suspect a lot of, whether there is a real trade-off or not depends on how far we can sort of somewhat restructure the sort of wider social expectations, working hours, jobs, and so on. I think that trying to make some of these changes on your own when no one else is making these changes is quite difficult. But if, so being the only person to cycle to work on a busy road full of cars is dangerous and unpleasant, but being one of dozens of people doing the same thing is probably much more pleasant. So I think there's an extent to which, if we can coordinate, we can make this much truer than if we fail to coordinate. And I think also this question, there's a sort of question here about these sort of intergenerational trade-offs, and the thing that I might come back to in other questions in this session. But I think, actually I don't have a background as a conventional economist. I came to economics quite late, but I would sort of, I think, give a bit of a plug to conventional economics here, in that, in a sense, we know how to do this, and the Stern Review told us how to do it, which is that we use a relatively low discount rate and we take tail risk seriously, and we think about our grandchildren and their grandchildren. And so in policy terms, I think that's how we do it. And in terms of, how people feel about that, I think we need to communicate that to people. There's often talk on the news about, well, if we cut our emissions, it just lets China emit more, rather than if we cut our emissions, it lets our grandchildren emit more, which people probably find much more acceptable.
Great. And Sandra, if you'd like to jump in on that one.
Sure. Yeah. Having everyone heard, make their arguments, and thinking of my own, I actually don't think that that there is no trade-off. I mean, I do think that there is a trade-off. Thinking about this now, we just don't really know how to quantify it. So I think I agreed with basically what everyone said. In some of our research, what we find is that this, for example, this anticipated warm glow of helping the environment, the DV is typically an index of 20 behaviors. So people assume that they're all the same. And so it doesn't matter what environmental behavior you engage in, it's just going to be positive for you. But in fact, when I did one paper where I split it out between high and low cost behaviors, and what we found is that the anticipation of feeling good from engaging with environmental behaviors only predicted the low cost type of actions and not the high cost actions. So buying an electric car or doing something that has a significant cost wasn't so much predicted by how good it's going to make you feel, for example. And so I do think there is this trade-off between what benefits people think that they're going to derive psychologically, physically from a behavior, and the actual cost of it. Thinking about some of these nature exposure programs, what's interesting is that if you look at those programs, how they operate, it's actually not clear whether the effect is driven by purely exposure to nature, so that no matter what you do, going out in the environment, doing something good, whether it's horticulture or some environmental behavior, or whether it's the fact that you're with other people that makes it a pleasant experience, or is it because of the health benefits of being outside, that are well shown to reduce depression and things like that? Or is it that, or is it something specific to nature? So I don't actually know if we can tease out what aspect of the environment it is that affects what type of well-being specifically. And as was just mentioned, it might differ for different groups of people. If you don't have many resources, maybe being outside in nature is going to be a waste of your time in terms of your well-being, if you have to make cost trade-offs. And so I actually think it's quite nuanced.
Yeah, again, I like that word, nuance. It's a good word for a setting like this. And Susanna, your thoughts would be great, please.
Yeah, well, I tend to agree. Everything is nuanced. It depends, and yeah, I will say that as a broad generalization, my intuition tells me that the trade-offs between pro-environmental behaviors that increase sustainability and current quality of life are gonna be quite small, and actually maybe even negative, or zero or negative. I tend to believe that, and this is more of a moral statement, I guess, that we live in a throwaway culture that doesn't make us particularly happy. And I think that those same trade-offs in poorer areas, and even in poorer countries, and even in poorer areas of rich countries, there may be real trade-offs. And I'll stop and I'll leave it at there. And I think we need to investigate those trade-offs, and, for example, the impact of that warm glow as a factor of income.
I thought of another thing, actually, which is something that came up in the chat yesterday. I think Emma posted it in the chat, which is this question of how much, whether you try and get a few people to make really big changes or try and make everyone make small changes, to paraphrase a little bit. People often bring up this idea of veganism. And as someone who loves food, I find that the prospect of veganism, I know it's ethically right, but utterly, I just can't countenance it. No butter, no cheese, no meat. Oh my God, I mean, it's impossible. But equally, I can switch from butter to spreadable butter, which is 50% vegetable oil, and I can eat chicken instead of beef occasionally, and I can eat, when I eat beef, I can eat it in 80% the quantity that I ate before, and maybe next year I can do the same. And so I think actually there's quite a lot of painless changes I can make, and I suspect most people would be able to make those changes quite painlessly. And I think maybe trying to start everyone off with small changes might work better and might be less painful than sort of telling everyone you've got to go vegan tomorrow, which perhaps they do, but I suspect that will lead to most people going vegan never and not having the impact that we want.
Maybe just to quickly add to what George is saying, maybe there's a difference between perceived and experience. So there's a lot of reactants to meat-free Mondays and things like that. But maybe the point that some people make is that once people settle into this, once you're vegetarian, once you eat less meat, then you're going to feel better, and in the end, it's all going to be positive. And so maybe maybe the barrier is the perception in terms of the reduction in well-being, rather than the eventual experience or how people reconstrue it. We also know that people reconstrue their own experiences in a biased way. Even though it was maybe negative, you remember it more positively. So I don't know, maybe it's about getting people over that hump.
So perhaps we need a Brexit supply crisis to mean that there's no beef in the shops for a month, and we'll all discover that we cope okay. I mean, I feel like actually lockdowns have done a little bit of that. You kind of discovered which things about seeing people in person do you really miss, which actually I find, events like this, I think I really miss being able to see people. But it surprises me that when I'm having a drink with one or two friends, actually doing that on Zoom is much less inferior than I expected. So, but yeah, having some situation where people have to try these things, which is quite difficult to engineer, would probably help too, wouldn't it?
Great. Could I ask people to start thinking about questions you'd like to pose to the panelists? And I'm just going to throw a couple of quick questions. We don't need to necessarily, I'll leave it open to the panelists themselves if they'd like to unmute to address it. So one question that came up, could you distinguish between just well-being and mental health more generally? And I just wonder, do you have thoughts about the broad area, the distinction we should make between the broad area of population well-being as opposed to the effect of the environment on mental health, or the interaction between the environment? Sorry about this, Patrick. This is a good example. The broad, give me 2 seconds, apologies.
That's nice. I like these things in Zoom. It's good when these things happen.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So I was just asking about the distinction between well-being and mental health. If you could just address the specific connection between the environment and mental health as it pertains to these discussions. Sorry about that again. Yeah, Lorraine, brilliant.
I mean, I'm definitely not an expert in this area, I have to say, but we are dabbling in the area of climate anxiety and eco-anxiety, and we're using measures that are derived from clinical measures of generalized anxiety disorder. And so this is kind of, like a clinical, like mental health type measure. And well, the first thing to say is that it is pretty low levels within the population, climate anxiety, when you measure it in that clinical way. But interestingly, what we have also found is that people who report more climate anxiety are doing more pro-environmental things. They are actually much more active in terms of helping tackle climate change, which suggests that maybe there is a healthy level of climate anxiety. In other words, you need to be a little bit worried about the climate crisis to actually want to do something about it. Although possibly there's a threshold beyond which it becomes sort of debilitating and impacts on your day-to-day functioning. But we're not seeing that seems to be extremely rare if that happens at all. And the second thing is that we also found that people that spend time in nature reported having higher levels of climate anxiety. And obviously there's probably lots of things going on there in terms of causality, etc. But whereas we did find, as you'd expect, people that spend time in green spaces to have lower levels of general anxiety, they have higher levels of climate anxiety. So this isn't, I don't know if this is answering your question, but I do think there is something interesting going on when we think about climate anxiety as maybe a new-ish phenomenon and what that actually means. And is it a good or bad thing in terms of people taking action, motivating adaptive responses to climate change, and how we might ameliorate it if it becomes too problematic for people. Yeah, so that's just one observation of what we're starting to do.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and there's some really interesting links in the chat. I think to the complexities of that one is brilliant. Would anyone else on the panel like to say anything about that? So I'm going to go to questions. I do have, as I said, a very long list. But I think that was enough from my side at the moment. And I have one question that I would like to ask with the panelists to finish off with. But for now, I think I'll move to the Q&A, and we're going to begin with Andrew, who isn't on the panel today, as I now know. But yeah, if you could go for the first question, Andrew.
Yes, one of the things I worry about, and I spoke about yesterday, is that people like most of us spend most of our time talking to others like us. And in fact, the worry, if you look at formal surveys or you just read the kinds of newspapers that academics don't tend to read, the worry is that many voters, maybe even the typical voter, don't think like most of us do at all. So although we might think intuitively people will be very happy switching to a green lifestyle, I'm afraid that's not what the typical person in the UK, let alone some other countries, thinks. Therefore, I'd like to ask the panel how they would persuade the voters, and there are millions and millions of them who don't want to go green. What should we do? Because we can't just bring in very expensive alternative energy. We have to take the voters with us. What does the panel think?
Yeah, great, Lorraine.
I think we can talk about the co-benefits of climate action, actually, and some of those may be well-being, but some of those are very tangible things, like it could reduce your energy bills, it could be quicker to get to where you want to if you cycle. Apparently in most cities it's actually quicker to cycle than it is to drive, so there's a convenience argument. There are lots of quite tangible arguments that you can make that some, maybe not all, climate actions are beneficial to take, that they do improve your life in various ways. But of course we need the structural measures to actually be able to make all climate actions be easier, cheaper, more convenient, etc. So as well as those sort of structural changes, regulations and economic measures and so on, in the meantime we can still talk about those co-benefits that do already exist, but we also need to build in those co-benefits more widely.
I think that's the million-dollar question. And I think we can, continue trying to communicate, properly inform rather than misinform. But I think that it is also incumbent on the political leaders to sometimes take unpopular measures if they... So, you can change maybe you cannot change the hearts and minds. Maybe you just, we need more bravery from the political class to solve some of these really urgent problems we are facing.
Sander?
Yeah, I think there are ways of tackling this. I mean, polls do show that people massively support action on climate change in the UK, but I think that there's an issue with lifestyle changes and people being willing to implement tough lifestyle changes. And I think that's, that's the tricky bit. I would say that, I like the idea of co-benefits. Sometimes appealing to multiple values can work. So, if you don't want to do it for the environment, you can do it because it's good for your health. You can do it because of other people. You can do it because of a national security risk. I mean, there's lots of frames that we could use, and the more you include, perhaps the greater the probability you'll hit home with the things that people care about across the population. But maybe also just norming. I think at the end of the day, a lot of people will succumb to normative pressure. And so once most people are doing something, once you have a critical mass, it becomes difficult for people to stay behind. And so implementing, both from government, signaling what the prototypical or desired behavior is, which is currently a bit chaotic and not always happening, but also bottom up in the sense that we visualize or let people know how many other people are actually changing their behavior, can have useful effects when that data is available. And maybe the third is through experience. Maybe people need to download Mappiness and realize how happy they are when they're outside. So I'll pivot to George on that last one.
So as I said, I do think people kind of, developed intuitions about what they enjoyed. And in general, I think they went in the direction that we'd hope they went. And I think to your broader question, Andrew, I think this question about the newspapers people read and who's in control of those newspapers is a big one, and it's mostly out of our hands. I occasionally wondered if we could crowdfund a buyout of the Daily Mail, but unfortunately they're very expensive. And I mean, this question that's been raised earlier about acting ahead of public opinion. I mean, we said, I think in the last question that, sometimes when we try things, we find out that they're not as bad, or maybe that they're worse than we think. But there are examples, where governments have acted ahead of public opinion that, have been researched, aren't there? There's things like people didn't, I think, support the smoking ban. The majority of people were against the smoking ban until shortly after it came in, and people changed their minds and found that it was a good thing. Imagine going to a pub and not having to wash all your clothes the next day. We couldn't imagine that, but it turned out to be really useful. Or similarly, I think, the introduction of seatbelts, congestion charging in London, where I think actually, the mayor was pretty clever and sort of talked it down. Was like, this is probably going to be a disaster. We'll probably have to give it up after 2 weeks. And then it turned out that actually it worked quite well and everyone was pretty happy with it in a short order. But that probably needs to be, supported by lots of research, because obviously it's scary for politicians to act ahead of public opinion and hope that public opinion is going to catch up with them. And the more assurance that researchers can give them that actually public opinion will catch up, the better.
It's really interesting. I mean, I won't comment. I'll allow the questions to come in and talk about it afterwards. So Dr. Ganga Sridhar.
Thanks everyone for an amazing discussion. I wanted to pick up this idea of some behaviors might be very costly, and maybe that changing those behaviors has a welfare implication. So do you think we have a set of policy instruments like nudges, as well as things like taxes and incentives, which might help sort of speak to alleviating some of those costs, but people tend to be not very clear about how best to use them, or whether they're in fact more acceptable or effective than nudges? So wanted to get your thoughts on what sort of policy instruments should we be using? Should we be primarily focusing on softer interventions like nudges, or actually going quite hard for economic incentives? Will they have different welfare effects? And should we really just focus on what's effective rather than the welfare implications if there's a trade-off there?
Lorraine,
well, this is a brilliant question, and I don't really have a great answer, but just the last bit of it, I think, should we only focus on the effectiveness of the measures or the sort of well-being or welfare kind of implications? I think no, because basically you will not get people to accept measures that they find deeply unfair, or just in some way kind of decrease their quality of life very significantly, or particularly if there's certain groups of people that are going to be, left behind or penalised. I think we know that fairness is a really important predictor of policy acceptability. So I think we do have to have at least a bit of an eye on what are the public going to accept and what is going to be fair, etc., as well as what is effective. And unfortunately, those two things are not very well correlated. So there is going to be a bit of a trade-off. So I sort of think in terms of then the first part of the question, should we just nudge people or should we do these other things as well, even though the other things might be more effective? There are some nudges that are like super effective, like getting people on the default like green energy tariffs, and you just get virtually everybody, and that's really super easy, and you don't actually even eliminate choice, so it's acceptable as well as effective. So there are a few cases like that. So let's just implement all of those straight away. Then you won't piss people off and they'll have an immediate effect. And then after a little while, we can sort of work on people about the slightly harder to sell things and ensure that they're designed in a way that they are not decreasing welfare for certain groups. And then hopefully we can bring in those regulations and economic measures also relatively soon. But I sort of feel like let's start with the quick wins, the nudges, and then let's move towards the other things as soon as we can.
Great. George?
Yeah, I mean, I think backing that up, I think we should do nudging and we should use behavioural science, but we must also use conventional economics. And we don't need only nudges. And I mean, the reason that it's easy to persuade people to sign up to a green energy tariff is broadly, I think, that the regulation around green energy tariffs means that they're almost meaningless. When you sign up to a genuinely green electricity tariff, you pay 30%, 50% more for your electricity. If we had a proper carbon tax at the right level, then probably everyone would be paying that much more for their electricity. But of course, we've got to make that fair and we've got to make that acceptable. So if you impose a large carbon tax that we need, then maybe you bring in something like a universal basic income so that this is kind of progressive and that on balance, people aren't losing out and they see that it's fair. And I think the prospects of a government like this doing something like that are basically nil. So we come back to that question of how do you persuade voters to not vote for a bunch of con men next time. I mean, in terms of the nudges, I mean, other kinds of nudges, I think, there are lots of things that we could do to make these things easier. I mean, one of the things that frustrates me, I've just become a governor of my kids' school. This is an old building. It's completely uninsulated. It has single glazed windows. It is completely nuts that public money doesn't go in to insulate that building tomorrow, because it would save public money, right? We're still at the point where there are interventions that can be made that make everyone better off almost immediately at net benefit to everybody. And it's utterly ludicrous that that's not happening. And instead, we're making it cheaper to fly domestically. I mean, in terms of nudges, one thing that strikes me is actually something that I thought would be quite fun to do research on. If anyone's interested in doing research on this, let me know. But when you get to checkout, when you do your online shopping, some of these supermarkets have a feature that says, oh, why don't you save 25p by switching from X to Y? And I always say no, because Y looks terrible. But I'm sure it must work because they wouldn't do it otherwise. So, there could be very similar things that say like, oh, it looks like you're making spaghetti bolognese. Why don't you switch 500 grams of beef to 400 grams of lamb? You'll find out that it tastes just as nice and it has a lower climate impact and it's basically costless, and you will save 18 kilos of carbon by doing it. So I think, giving people that information at the point where they're making decisions would be really interesting. And I think we should try that. But yeah, we really should do the conventional economics and then, work on making it acceptable with behavioral science and not rely on this kind of nudging, because the nudgings that are universally acceptable are generally because they have a really limited impact, I think.
Great. And Sander?
Yeah, I agreed on the nudging, but I've become more convinced of this idea of ethical persuasion. I think there's a lot of research now that shows that when you make people aware of the nudge, when you're transparent about it, and maybe even when you make people a partner in the nudge, they're much more likely to comply than when they're an unwitting participant of the nudge. And in fact, revealing the purpose of the nudge doesn't seem to decrease its efficacy. So I think I like that idea of in terms of getting public opinion on board, in terms of how we could do nudges differently. The other is that I also would support traditional measures. There's a lot of support for incentives and things like that, but as long as they don't crowd out people's intrinsic goals and motivations. I mean, in certain cases, they can certainly crowd out people's, we don't want people to think that technology is going to fix it, or that, they can throw money at the problem and then, they don't have to do anything about it. So, you know, preserving people's own motivation, I think, is going to be an important aspect. And then the last thing, just to come back to this prison experiment, what struck me is that a lot of the people there were actually making the argument that they don't need traditional incentives anymore in the prison. Like, what, they don't have to punish people. They don't have to have economic incentives, you know, lotteries, traditional. What could be better than just letting people out walk in nature for free and then improve the welfare of everyone? And you don't need any economic tools in order to make that work. And I think that it's probably not going to work, not only because the evidence for it is a bit questionable, but also because ultimately it's not going to be feasible. Violent offenders can't walk out, you know, unsupervised. And in fact, it might decrease the welfare of other people in the same population if they're worried that there's, you know, violent people walking around. So just to use it as a metaphor for a government or a population, I think ultimately some measures are going to increase some people's welfare, but decrease other people's welfare. And some people just can't be reached with certain types of interventions. So at the end of the day, I think we're going to need a combination of both, as long as they enhance and not undermine each other.
Great, and there's a fantastic set of comments going in the chat. So I'm going to try to adhere to the trust put in me as the chair to keep the session on time, just by moving to the concluding question. And I'll put you on the spot a little bit. So sorry that this is such a sort of direct question, but having reflected on the connections between environment, behaviour, and well-being. And I thought this session was brilliant in terms of the nuances, and I've written down so many points I want to go back and think about afterwards. But if you did have to give a relatively top-line comment to people at COP26 today about what this literature is saying, what would you say in terms of what it implies for action, and maybe even to the students and researchers and people working in agencies here? What would be your sort of takeaway in terms of these connections and what they imply for action on climate at the moment? And I can maybe start again with Lorraine.
Oh, bugger. I thought you'd ask somebody else first and I could have a chance to think about it. Well, I guess what we know is that the best way to sort of communicate with anybody, including policymakers, is to frame your argument around what they care about, around their values, their concerns and needs, etc. So I sort of think if we're kind of be trying to persuade policymakers in particular about taking action on climate, we need to be cognizant of what they are concerned about. What crisis are they dealing with at the moment? What are they mindful of in terms of voters and lobbyists, etc., when they're making decisions? And if at the moment it's around, you know, saving money or creating jobs or something, then we construct arguments around, you know, that are compelling, that, you know, it's about these co-benefits again. We just did a report a couple of weeks ago, the AMS and Royal Society, looking at the health co-benefits of climate action, climate mitigation in particular. And there are so many, and you can quantify these. And so we're talking about billions of pounds that the NHS would save if they weren't dealing with like people dying from air pollution and obesity and all these things that are linked to high carbon choices. So if we get people to eat less red meat and dairy and stuff, if we get people to walk and cycle more instead of driving, we'd save masses of money, we'd save masses of lives. And I can't help thinking that those sorts of things, those sorts of arguments are more compelling than some of the things which we maybe sort of naturally, you know, how we naturally construct arguments to tackle climate change around sort of emissions and dying polar bears and things. So yeah, I guess it's sort that would be my initial sort of thought around, right, this is what we do. Like, let's construct some really good arguments about this is good for people, voters will like you because it'll improve their well-being, etc.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. It's a very compelling, it's a really interesting takeaway. So thank you very much for that. And sorry, Sandra, you're next.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short. You know, at the end of the day, I think we need to help people persuade the government to take action. And so one of the things we've done ahead of COP26 was we did a massive poll with YouGov in I think 20 countries. And what we found, whether it was China, the US, or the UK, people were just massively supporting that the government take action on climate change, and just getting that data in front of policymakers that their citizens are demanding that they do something about it, I think can be quite powerful, because they're concerned about the interests of their constituents. And so when we can show that there's a mismatch between what the government is doing and what the people want, I think that can be a powerful motivator. And then I think the other aspect is that in order for larger scale change to happen, I think people do take cues from elites, and public opinion is very much affected by it. And so what can governments do to consistently convey the message that changing towards greener lifestyles is important? Because personally, I'm perceiving a lot of inconsistent communications from different governments on what they're doing and what we need to be doing. And so if they could only have a consistent communication policy, I think that would help a lot.
Great. Again, really, really strong takeaway. Thank you very much, Sandra. And George?
I mean, exactly following on from that, Boris Johnson arriving and leaving COP, I think, in a private jet is the key here. And we know how damaging that is when, we think about Barnard Castle, and, people are willing to observe lockdown if they find that everybody's doing it, including the people who are making the rules. But the people who are making the rules, not following the rules, is just, I think, so damaging. And that comes on to kind of a wider point. I mean, I despair a little bit, and sometimes I'm just a bit disillusioned with looking at well-being. It's good to know what enhances social welfare if your government is interested in social welfare. But a government that pursues the hardest possible Brexit on the narrowest possible of margins obviously doesn't care about social welfare, or it certainly doesn't primarily care about social welfare. So I think Lorraine is right. You need to figure out what do they care about, and I suppose you need to target that. There always feels like a little bit of a kind of dissonance in thinking, okay, so what they care about is not that people are happy and that people don't die and that we have more money. It's quite hard to get your head around, but that's obviously important. And I think, as I said earlier, I think we just need to encourage them to be brave and not just, and as it's been said in the chat, behavioral science actually goes well beyond nudging. We've mainly been talking about nudging, and there's lots of other behavioral science that we should encourage them to bring in, including, I guess, for example, if we change incentives, make sure that they don't crowd out people's intrinsic motivations, but, do encourage them to bring in incentives. We don't just want nudging, we want incentives too. Please.
Great, and no pressure, Susanna, but the final word after three, I think, very strong takeaways.
Yeah, no pressure. I will say throw everything at it. So again, be brave, lead by example, summarizing what I've heard. Use nudging to improve the acceptability of policies that may be unpopular now, but that are absolutely necessary, and that may be costly now, but use behavioral insights to try to make them less costly. And yeah, do something, please.
Folks, thank you very much. I think we'll all agree that we learned a lot from four top experts who are eloquent and very generous with their time. So can we give them a round of applause however you'd like to, traditionally or digitally? And thank you very much for your fascinating comments as well. And I'll hand back over to the organisers and end the session now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Liam, as well as the speakers. All of you were great. It's not surprising, but it's always great to actually hear and have these conversations.